The early era. At the time of the UFC's debut in 1993, Dana White had no connection with the organization. The very first fights were like street fights, but organized into a tournament format. There were no rules, no judges, and no weight classes. You could see a fighter twice the size of his opponent kick him in the face while he was on the ground. And it was completely legal. Royce Gracie became the UFC's first real star after submitting Jimerson, Shamrock, and Gordeau to win the first ever UFC tournament. While Ken Shamrock began to rise in the following events, Gracie remained the dominant force, winning 2 of the first 3 tournaments. In 1995, the UFC introduced its first ever singles match between Gracie and Shamrock, but the highly anticipated bout ended up disappointing fans. The fight lasted 36 minutes with very little action, drawing boos from the crowd and ultimately ending in a draw. That controversial fight led to major changes. The UFC would start to introduce time limits, judges to decide draws, and referees were given authority to stand up fighters who were inactive. This era built the foundation for the sport, with Gracie and Shamrock leading the way. The Dark Era. Back in 1996, the UFC had a serious image problem. With barely any rules and brutal finishes, it was seen by many as extremely violent. Senator John McCain called it human cockfighting and launched a full-blown campaign to get it banned. His efforts worked. The UFC was banned in over 30 states, pulled from cable TV, and left scrambling. The company was losing money fast and slowly fading from the spotlight. But instead of giving up, the UFC adapted. They started changing the rules to make the sport safer and more legitimate. In 1997, UFC 12 introduced weight classes, and that same night, a young Vitor Belfort made his debut. A few events later, gloves became mandatory and dangerous moves like headbutts and shots to the back of the head were officially banned. As icon Royce Gracie stepped away, new names like Randy Couture and Tito Ortiz entered the octagon and began rising through the ranks. In 2000, the UFC made a huge move by partnering with state athletic commissions to get officially sanctioned. California was first to approve a unified rule set for MMA, and New Jersey quickly followed. Once that happened, other states began to follow, and the UFC started rebuilding its reputation. UFC 28 became the first fully sanctioned event under these new rules, and it even featured the only super heavyweight fight in UFC history, won by Josh Barnett via TKO. But even with all these changes, the UFC was still in serious trouble. The owners were pouring millions into events, but they weren't making any money back. By the end of 2000, the company was deep in debt and dangerously close to shutting down for good. This era was pure survival mode, facing bans, losing money, and living on the edge. The modern era. In January 2001, Zuffa LLC, a company established by Frank and Lorenzo Fertitta, with Dana White as its public face, purchased the UFC for $2 million. That same year, they started turning things around by working with state athletic commissions and getting the sport officially sanctioned in places like Nevada and New Jersey. This opened the door for the UFC to slowly make its way back onto pay-per-view and start building a real fan base again. By 2002, Tito Ortiz, the reigning light heavyweight champion, faced Ken Shamrock in a super fight and secured the victory when Shamrock's corner stopped the bout. In 2003, a rivalry sparked between Randy Couture and Chuck Liddell, with Randy pulling off a surprising TKO victory. But for Chuck, the story with Randy was far from over. That same year, Nick Diaz made a strong UFC debut, earning a victory by armbar submission. The momentum carried into 2004, with BJ Penn stunning fans by submitting Matt Hughes to claim the welterweight title. Months later, Chuck Liddell delivered a second-round knockout in his long-awaited clash with Tito Ortiz. The year ended with a banger as Matt Hughes submitted GSP in his first title shot. Even with better fights and fresh talent on the rise, the UFC was still losing millions. But in 2005, everything changed with the debut of The Ultimate Fighter, a reality show on Spike TV. It wasn't just a hit, it blew up. The Season 1 finale, featuring Forrest Griffin versus Stephan Bonnar, delivered one of the most unforgettable fights in MMA history and pulled fans in like never before. By 2006, after that first season, Chuck Liddell came back and knocked out Randy Couture, not just once but twice, becoming the face of the UFC. That same year, MMA legend Royce Gracie made his return after 11 years, but Matt Hughes quickly ended that comeback with a TKO. From there, pay-per-view numbers shot through the roof. Tito Ortiz crushed Ken Shamrock twice in a row, but not long after, Tito was the one on the losing end when Chuck took him out by TKO. Around the same time, Matt Hughes got his revenge on BJ Penn with a TKO win. only to get knocked out himself when GSP landed a brutal head kick that finished the fight. The GOAT era. By 2007, GSP, who looked unstoppable, was stunned by Matt Serra, who finished him with a TKO win to take the welterweight belt. That same year, Quinton "Rampage" Jackson made his UFC debut and knocked out Chuck Liddell to end his title reign. Meanwhile, Anderson Silva was on a tear at middleweight, making it look easy as he dominated everyone who stepped in front of him. In 2008, GSP came back with something to prove. He dominated Matt Serra in the rematch, winning by TKO and reclaiming his title. It was the beginning of one of the most dominant title runs the UFC has ever seen. BJ Penn won the lightweight belt by submitting Joe Stevenson at UFC 80. Then at UFC 81, Brock Lesnar made his much-anticipated debut, but his hype was put on hold when Frank Mir finished him with a knee bar. A young John Jones also quietly made his debut around this time, winning his first fight by decision. 2009 delivered a massive champ vs champ showdown. BJ Penn moved up to challenge GSP, but GSP completely controlled the fight, and Penn's corner stopped it after the 4th round. At UFC 98, Lyoto Machida made his mark with a devastating knockout over Rashad Evans, becoming the light heavyweight champ while still undefeated. But that wouldn't last. Then came UFC 100. It was the biggest event in UFC history up to that point. Lesnar got his revenge on Frank Mir with a nasty TKO and became the undisputed heavyweight champ. GSP outclassed Thiago Alves, and Dan Henderson delivered a legendary knockout on Michael Bisping. The momentum rolled into 2010. GSP kept doing GSP things, clean, dominant wins over Dan Hardy and Josh Koscheck. Anderson Silva also continued to dominate at middleweight, but Machida's undefeated run ended when Shogun Rua took him out with a TKO. Frankie Edgar defeated BJ Penn twice to become the new lightweight champion. Just like that, the torch was passed. Brock Lesnar also passed the torch to the undefeated Cain Velasquez after a first-round TKO loss at UFC 121. On October 28, 2010, the UFC officially merged with the WEC, introducing the bantamweight and featherweight divisions. This era witnessed the rise of all-time greats and a sharp increase in mainstream popularity. The popular era. On August 18, 2011, the UFC signed a 7-year deal with Fox, bringing MMA to mainstream network TV in the US. The very first event was headlined by Cain Velasquez versus Junior Dos Santos. It ended in just 64 seconds, with Dos Santos knocking Cain out to become the new heavyweight champion. At UFC 128, John Jones made history. At just 23 years old, he completely dominated Mauricio Shogun Rua to become the youngest UFC champion ever. From there, John entered his prime and started beating everyone they put in front of him. Meanwhile, UFC 137 gave us a gritty fight between BJ Penn and Nick Diaz. Diaz came out on top, and unfortunately, it marked the start of a losing streak for BJ that he never really recovered from. By 2012, Dana White confirmed that women would now be fighting in the UFC, and the first woman signed was none other than Ronda Rousey, the Strikeforce bantamweight champ and a rising star. Cain Velasquez got his revenge on Dos Santos at UFC 155, taking back his belt with a dominant performance. Anderson Silva was still on top too, beating Chael Sonnen again, but 2013 brought a shocker. Silva, who hadn't lost in years and was riding a 17-fight win streak, was knocked out by Chris Weidman at UFC 162. In their rematch at UFC 168, things got even worse. Silva broke his leg throwing a kick, and Weidman stayed champion. Around the same time, Cain and Dos Santos fought for the third and final time. Cain won again and ended their trilogy. GSP retired in 2013 after wins over Nick Diaz and Johnny Hendricks, leaving the sport with an incredible 12-fight win streak. In 2014, Conor McGregor started grabbing everyone's attention with flashy knockouts and trash talk. At the same time, Ronda Rousey continued her dominance, finishing Alexis Davis in just 16 seconds. That year also saw TJ Dillashaw pull off one of the biggest upsets in UFC history, putting on an incredible performance to dethrone Renan Barão and win the title. Then in 2015, one of the biggest rivalries ever kicked off, John Jones versus Daniel Cormier. Jones won their first fight by decision, but their story was far from over. At UFC 189, Conor delivered a standout performance, claiming the interim title with a TKO victory over Chad Mendes. Later that year, he knocked out Jose Aldo in just 13 seconds to become the featherweight champion. Conor was at the peak of his career. His knockout power and charisma on the mic brought in massive revenue for both himself and the UFC. Holly Holm became a star overnight at UFC 193, when she stunned the world with a head kick knockout that handed Ronda Rousey her first ever loss. This era was all about creating megastars like Conor McGregor and Ronda Rousey. The Golden Age. 2016 kicked off with a shocker. Nate Diaz stunned the world by submitting Conor McGregor in the second round. But Conor got his revenge later that year at UFC 202, winning a gritty 5-round war by majority decision. He wasn't the only one getting revenge. Michael Bisping, fighting with just one good eye, knocked out Luke Rockhold in their rematch to win the middleweight title. At UFC 200, a new star was rising. Amanda Nunes stopped Miesha Tate to become the women's bantamweight champion. Months later, she ended Ronda Rousey's fighting career with a first-round KO. Conor closed out 2016 by making history. He dominated Eddie Alvarez to become the first UFC fighter to hold 2 championship belts at the same time. In 2017, GSP returned after a 4-year break, moved up to middleweight, and submitted Michael Bisping at UFC 217 to win the title. Not long after, GSP vacated the belt and retired once again. Earlier that year, the heated rivalry between Jon Jones and Daniel Cormier continued, with Jones winning by knockout at UFC 214, though the result was later overturned due to a failed drug test. Meanwhile, Max Holloway was on a roll. Riding a 10-fight win streak, he finished Jose Aldo twice to become the new featherweight champion. 2018 was another milestone year. Daniel Cormier made history by knocking out Stipe Miocic at UFC 226 to become the second fighter to hold 2 belts at once. Then came the biggest UFC fight ever, Khabib Nurmagomedov versus Conor McGregor for the lightweight title. Khabib won, and the fight became the highest-selling UFC pay-per-view ever, with 2.4 million buys. By the end of 2018, Amanda Nunes joined the Double Champ Club as well, knocking out Chris Cyborg in under a minute to become the women's featherweight champion. In 2019, Israel Adesanya broke through as a superstar. He delivered a Fight of the Year performance against Kelvin Gastelum, and then knocked out Robert Whittaker at UFC 243 to claim the middleweight belt. Jorge Masvidal also exploded in popularity that year, with a KO win over Darren Till, a record-breaking 5-second flying knee knockout on Ben Askren at UFC 239, and a dominant win over Nate Diaz at UFC 244 to earn the BMF title. At UFC 241, Stipe Miocic reclaimed the heavyweight title from DC with a 4th-round TKO. And to cap off 2019, Kamaru Usman defeated rival Colby Covington in a 5-round war at UFC 245. This era was the golden era of the UFC, a time when the sport saw the rise of its biggest stars, record-breaking pay-per-views, multiple double champions, and global growth that took MMA to an entirely new level. The COVID era. In March 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic shut down sports across the globe, but UFC President Dana White refused to hit pause. The UFC quickly adapted, creating Fight Island in Abu Dhabi to host international fighters who couldn't enter the US, while events in the US took place in Jacksonville and Las Vegas, all behind closed doors. At UFC 251, Kamaru Usman shut down the Jorge Masvidal hype, winning by decision to defend his welterweight title. Later that summer at UFC 252, Stipe and Daniel settled their trilogy. Stipe won by decision and secured his legacy as the greatest heavyweight in UFC history. Soon after, undefeated middleweights Israel Adesanya and Paulo Costa faced off. Adesanya stole the show, finishing Costa with a TKO in round 2. July 2020 saw the arrival of a new star, Khamzat Chimaev, who fought and won twice in just 10 days with devastating finishes. He capped off the year with a second knockout win, going 3-0 in his debut year. But Kevin Holland went even further. He racked up 5 wins in 2020, stealing the spotlight. That same year, Khabib submitted Justin Gaethje in round 2 and retired as an undefeated legend. Another legend, Anderson Silva, also chose to retire in 2020. 2021 started off with Dustin Poirier knocking out Conor McGregor at UFC 257, handing Conor his first KO loss ever. They met again months later for a trilogy bout, but the fight ended in heartbreak for Conor after he broke his leg at the end of round 1. At UFC 259, Adesanya attempted to become a 2-division champ, but fell short against Jan Blachowicz, who used his size and grappling to win by decision. Events later, Jorge Masvidal got his rematch with Usman, but this time, Usman knocked him out cold, handing Masvidal the first KO loss of his career. With Khabib retired, Charles Oliveira stepped up. He fought Michael Chandler for the vacant lightweight title at UFC 262 and won with a second-round TKO. Just one event later, Brandon Moreno made history by submitting Davison Figueiredo to become the first Mexican-born UFC champion. Francis Ngannou closed out the year with a brutal KO on Stipe, claiming the heavyweight title. This era was quieter due to empty arenas, but it was full of excitement. New stars like Kamaru Usman, Israel Adesanya, and Charles Oliveira rose to dominance. The new era. Leon Edwards began 2022 in spectacular fashion by knocking out Kamaru Usman with a head kick in the final minute, becoming the new welterweight champion. At UFC 280, Charles Oliveira passed the torch to Islam Makhachev, who submitted him in the second round to claim the lightweight title. Months later, Islam defended his belt in a 5-round war against Alexander Volkanovski at UFC 284, winning by unanimous decision. When they met again, Volkanovski stepped in on short notice. But this time, Makhachev finished the fight quickly with a first-round head kick knockout. Meanwhile, Alex Pereira shocked the world by knocking out Israel Adesanya in the 5th round to take the middleweight title. But Adesanya got his revenge just a few months later, knocking out Pereira to win back the middleweight title. In March 2023, Jon Jones returned after a 3-year break and made his heavyweight debut at UFC 285, where he easily submitted Cyril Gane in the first round to become a 2-division champion. That same night, history was made in the women's flyweight division as Alexa Grasso submitted longtime champion Valentina Shevchenko in the 4th round. Their rematch ended in a draw, but in the trilogy fight, Shevchenko came out on top, reclaiming her title by decision. Sean O'Malley lived up to the hype in 2023, knocking out Aljamain Sterling at UFC 292 to become the bantamweight champion. To close out 2023, Sean Strickland outclassed Adesanya over 5 rounds and won the middleweight title by unanimous decision. Strickland went on to defend his belt at UFC 297 against Dricus du Plessis, but lost via split decision, making Dricus the new middleweight champion. Not long after, Alexander Volkanovski's long reign came to an end when Ilia Topuria knocked him out in the 2nd round to claim the featherweight belt. April 2024 gave us UFC 300, one of the greatest cards in UFC history. Alex Pereira knocked out Jamahal Hill with his trademark left hook, and Max Holloway delivered a legendary performance, knocking out Justin Gaethje in a fight fans will never forget. UFC 302 introduced the Golden Champion gloves, and on that same night, Islam Makhachev showcased his dominance once again by submitting Dustin Poirier in the 5th round. Shortly after, Adesanya was on the hunt to reclaim the title from Dricus, but in the end, Dricus retained his belt after submitting Adesanya. At UFC 306, Merab Dvalishvili became the new bantamweight king after a dominant performance against Sean O'Malley. History was made at UFC 308 when Ilia Topuria became the first fighter to KO Max Holloway. Earlier that night, Khamzat Chimaev made a huge statement by submitting Whitaker in the 1st round. In the following event, Jon returned to action and dominated Stipe, winning by TKO in the 3rd round. After the fight, Stipe officially announced his retirement. He wasn't alone. This era also marked the retirement of other UFC fighters like Amanda Nunes, Jose Aldo, Luke Rockhold, Jorge Masvidal, and Donald Cerrone. As many greats stepped away, a new generation began to rise. Fighters like Paddy Pimblett, Renier de Ridder, Ian Gary, and Shavkat Rakhmonov have all started to make names for themselves. This era was all about rising stars taking over, unexpected title changes, and future legends making their mark. It gave us some of the most exciting super fights and unforgettable debuts in recent memory.